So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! The Detroit Lions have changed their roster pretty drastically over the last couple of weeks. Long gone are some of the players that started for the Detroit Lions in the NFC Championship game and income upgraded players with Pro Bowl caliber resumes, players with big money and big contracts, and players that are going to stand with the Detroit Lions and help them reach the Super Bowl. And today, I wanted to take a look at the updated roster post free agency. Now, free agency isn't technically over, right? The Lions can obviously still sign people if they so wish. They have about $20 million left in cap space to use. So there is a chance that the Lions go out and potentially do make a signing and they potentially do add to this roster and continue to grow before the draft. But for the most part, I think the Lions are probably done. They've addressed their biggest needs. They've set themselves up for success in the draft, and they really don't have any gaping holes on the roster that require a fulfillment through free agency. So today we're going to take a look at the roster. We're going to take a look at the good and the bad of the roster. We're going to take a look at the strengths and weaknesses. We're going to take a look at where the Detroit Lions potentially may address in the NFL draft in some of the spots that may not have as much depth as you once thought. So with that being said, let's start off with an easy one, the quarterbacking position. Jared Goff is your quarterback 1, and Hendon Hooker is your quarterback 2. Jared Goff is coming off of arguably his best season as a professional quarterback, having a 67.3 completion percentage, throwing for 4,575 yards, putting him second in the NFL in that statistic, 30 passing touchdowns and 12 interceptions, which is the best touchdown to interception ratio of his career. Jared Goff is coming off of, again, arguably the best season of his career. Ben Johnson is returning. Mostly the entire offense around him is returning. And if anything, this offense should get better as guys grow and develop, as Sam Laporta develops, as the offensive line continues to grow, as, Jahmyr Gibbs continues to improve and get better, as Jameson Williams continues to grow and get better. Theoretically, Jared Goff should be a better quarterback next year, even still compared to the quarterback he was in 2023. Hendon Hooker, your third-round pick from the 2023 draft from the University of Tennessee, is going to be the backup. We have yet to see him play in the NFL, as last preseason he was injured and on the NFI list. I think he's going to be a fun player to watch in the preseason. I think there's a lot of potential of him to become the quarterback 1 of the future, but of course that is still yet to be seen. I think we still have to wait a little bit longer before we get a true evaluation of quarterback Hendon Hooker. Now, do I see the Detroit Lions addressing this in the draft? Not really. Potentially a UDFA guy like Adrian Martinez from a year ago. Potentially somebody just to play some reps during the preseason with both Teddy Bridgewater and David Blau retiring. But I do not see a serious contribution put into the quarterbacking room. Again, a free agent, a potential, a UDFA maybe for the preseason. They will probably add a quarterback 3 and 4 for some depth in the preseason, but I find it very hard to believe that they will put some serious draft stock or capital into any quarterback prospect for the time being. Going over to the running backs. The running back position is pretty good. Jahmyr Gibbs coming off of a Pro Bowl rookie season, with David Montgomery coming off of a 1,000-yard rushing season. The Lions also brought back Craig Reynolds and Zonovan Knight to be the running backs 3 and 4 on this roster. Obviously, Reynolds had that big touchdown in the playoffs, and Knight, although was injured very early in his career in Detroit, I think still has quite a bit to show, and I think shows a lot of good things for the Lions in the meantime. Do I think the Lions could potentially go out and look for another running back 3? I think it's very possible. Both David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs missed time last year. And even though we really like Craig Reynolds is not the most efficient guy to run behind. And even with that offensive line, he really struggled in games versus the Raiders, really struggled versus the Bucs. And I think they could potentially look to find a more explosive back to push Reynolds as the running back 4 and have a rookie or potentially a veteran as the running back 3. Just add some more depth, add some more explosiveness. I think it's an option, but I don't think it's going to be high on the priority list for Detroit. Nor will the tight end position, as Sam Laporta, Brock Wright, James Mitchell, and Shane Zylstra are the 4 tight ends that currently make up this roster. Now, in my headcanon, do I want the Detroit Lions to go out and get Jeremiah Bell from Florida State, a freaky athletic tight end to stretch the field and pair with Sam Laporta? I absolutely do. Do I think tight end could potentially be an option for the Lions in the draft? Absolutely. Brock Wright has 1 year left on his deal. James Mitchell has 1 year left on his deal. Shane Zylstra, I believe, has just 1 year left on his deal. So with that being the case, there is a shot that the Lions go out on day 3 and they find an athletic tight end. They find a tight end that can stretch the field. They find a guy that can fit in as tight end 2 or tight end 3 and make the offense even better. We know that Ben Johnson loves his 2 tight end personnels, and I think it's not a far stretch to believe that the Lions could spend a pick on a tight end, especially if a good one falls in their lap. But again, I don't see a lot of high draft capital here. Potentially a day 3 pick, but certainly not a day 1 or 2 pick. Wide receiver, however, is potentially a different story. With Amon-Ra St. Brown coming off of his all-pro season, Jamison Williams hopefully set for a breakout year 3, Khalif Raymond returning from injury with both Antoine Green and Donovan Peoples-Jones being potential role players, the Lions still don't really have an X. With the departure of Josh Reynolds, the Lions wide receiving core is a little bit thin, even though I think it's really good, even though I have a lot of faith in Amon-Ra, even though I think that JMO is going to take a big step, even though I fully trust Khalif Raymond, I even like Donovan Peoples-Jones and Antoine Green to take some snaps next year. I wouldn't be surprised if the Lions go out and they get a wide receiver really early. If that's, Brian Thomas, if that's Xavier Legette from South Carolina, if it's a big X wide receiver, even Adonai Mitchell from Texas is a potential player I could see the Lions having some interest in. And I think they could potentially complete the roster, right? The Lions have, I would say, their Z wide receiver in Jamison Williams. They have their slot wide receiver in Amon-Ra St. Brown, but they still yet to have their X, despite signing DJ Chark, despite signing Tyrell Williams, despite, trying year after year after year to get that X. They don't have that guy right now, and they really haven't had that guy for a majority of the tenure here. So I think getting that X wide receiver, a field stretcher, a big body, a guy in the mold of a DK Metcalf, a guy in the mold of a CeeDee Lamb could really help the Detroit Lions offense explode even farther next season than they already do. And I think that this is a kind of a sneaky wild card thing for the Lions to potentially look at in the first round. Taking a look at the offensive line, I would argue it's better than last year. Taylor Decker at left tackle, Graham Glasgow at left guard, Frank Ragnow at center with Kevin Zeitler at right guard and Penei Sewell at right tackle. There is a little bit of age there, of course, with Decker, Glasgow, and Zeitler all being over 30 years old at this point, but Ragnow potentially retiring. Penei Sewell is the only, in my opinion, long-term option on the offensive line. I think Penei Sewell has a good decade left in the league. I think Frank Ragnow could potentially retire early due to some injury concerns, but he might have 2 to 3 years left. I think Taylor Decker still has 3 to 4 really productive years left as well. So I don't think it's an immediate need for tackle, but I do think every single offensive line position is in play for the NFL draft. I do think they could potentially draft a tackle. I do think they could and probably will draft a guard/center, if not 2, in this year's NFL draft. And despite having the best offensive line in football, I still think Brad might put more emphasis into this offensive line going forward and continuing and really try to get this thing right for a long time. Now, scooching over the defensive line as of right now is definitely better than last year, but I think still could use some work. Aiden Hutchinson, DJ Reader, Aleem McNeil, and Marcus Davenport is your projected starting 4 on the defensive line. Marcus Davenport, I think, is an upgrade over Romeo Okwara and Charles Harris from a year ago, but I do think there is still some work to be done. I think there should still be some player to be drafted at that position, as well as potentially another free agent to be signed. I like Josh Paschal. I like John Kaminsky, but I really think the Lions need a true dominant second edge rusher that can stay healthy alongside Aiden Hutchinson. and I don't think that guy is currently on the roster. Defensive tackles, another position the Lions could look for some depth, but I don't see a lot of contributions on the interior early unless a player like Jazeer Newton falls or potentially a guy like Tavondre Sweat or Byron Murphy. Moving over to the linebackers, I think the Lions are pretty set at this position. Jack Campbell going into his second year, Alex Anzalone going into the second year of his 3-year deal, Derek Barnes on a rookie contract, Malcolm Rodriguez on a rookie contract, and Jalen Reeves-Maybin freshly signed to a 2-year extension. This linebacking core is good. It's improving. It's really, really solid. It is young. It is cheap. And I do not think it will be touched in the offseason. I think it is pretty much set in stone. Could they add a sixth linebacker for special teams? Absolutely. But as far as players getting linebacker depth and linebacker reps, I think it is pretty set in stone, and I see this changing very, very little. Going to the cornerbacks, obviously, you have replaced Kendall Vilder with Carlton Davis. You've brought in Amik Robertson. You've re-signed Emmanuel Mosley. You are now really 4 deep at boundary cornerback with Stephen Gilmore getting some opportunities as cornerback 5. I would not be surprised if the Lions go out and draft a player like Kool-Aid McKinstry or potentially Kenyon Mitchell from Toledo if they do fall. I think they're still very much in the market for a young DB for the long term. But as of right now, I think that this cornerback room is much improved. I think it is very good. And I do think that despite maybe not having a top 10 cornerback, I do think they are potentially top 10 in the NFL as far as cornerback depth. And that is very important going through the season. Now, some of you might ask, well, what about Brian Branch? I consider Brian Branch a safety at this point. Brian Branch will be a nickel cornerback / safety for the Detroit Lions. I think his role could very much be expanded going into next year, but I think he's going to be a safety as well, with obviously Kirby Joseph and Ifeatu Melifonwu being the deep safeties, with them being really good, strong starting safeties. I think Brian Branch is going to have the versatility to move around. On 3 safety sets, if you consider that, you're going to have Brian Branch in the slot. You could have a 4 safety set like they did last year in the playoffs and put Brian Branch at safety and Cam Sutton in the slot, right? There's a lot of opportunity to move some pieces around. Brandon Joseph also in there as well, a player that I was very impressed with in the preseason. There's a lot of depth here in the secondary now, and I think that the Lions could potentially go out and still get a veteran, maybe a Quandre Diggs or a late round pick in the draft. But as of right now, I think the secondary is pretty good. Potentially a top-end guy at the top of the draft or maybe some depth, but I don't see a lot changing here either. I think the starting secondary is pretty set, maybe outside of one position. I think overall the Lions are pretty set at the roster positions right now. Going into the NFL draft and as we move forward into April, I think that the positions we're really going to focus on as the Detroit Lions are wide receiver, offensive line, potentially cornerback 1, and potentially an edge rusher. If you get those 4 positions in the draft, if you can get 4 starters or 4 quality players, quality role players at those positions, I think you really pretty much ace the draft. And then if you can get a depth tight end, if you can get a role player tight end in there as well, that helps even more. But with that being said, I think the Lions are pretty set going into 2024. Their schedule's a little tougher. Their division's a little tougher, but I don't see them swaying too much. And I very much see them repeating as the number 1 team from the North and potentially the number 1 seed in all of football. Well, with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Let me know your comments and your thoughts about the roster going into the draft down in the comments below. Very curious what you guys have to say and what you guys think about it. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so very much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go live.